Flames ripped across the sky, tearing apart everything in their path. Johnson's P-47. Thunderbolt shuddered violently as explosions detonated around him. Pieces of wing and fuselage spun through the air, tumbling in fire. The cockpit filled with smoke, the smell of burning oil and metal thick and choking. The radio erupted with terrified voices. "He's behind me! I can't shake him!" Another voice. "Pull up! Pull up!" Static cut the rest of the words, swallowed by the roar of engines and gunfire. A German FW-190 dove out of the clouds, sleek and ruthless, guns blazing. Tracer rounds tore through the air, shredding the sky. Johnson tried to move the controls, but the stick felt frozen in his hands. One round tore through his left wing, sending sparks across the cockpit. Another ripped into the fuselage behind him. Smoke filled the cabin. He could see his own blood streaked across the windshield, his hands shaking as he fought to keep the plane steady. Another pilot tumbled past, body spinning helplessly toward the ground. The world had turned into chaos. Fire, smoke, falling aircraft, screaming voices, and the constant pounding of engines. The German fighter pulled alongside, wings close enough that Johnson could see the pilot's face through the canopy. Calm, cold, certain. The ace raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture that spoke more than words ever could. He wasn't greeting him. He was warning him. Johnson's heart pounded in his chest. The P-47 shivered under him, smoke trailing from the engine, the fuselage groaning. He tried to pull back, tried to roll, tried to fight the controls that wouldn't respond. His vision blurred. Pain stabbed his arm and shoulder where a round had hit. The plane was breaking, but he had to survive. He leveled the Thunderbolt as best he could, forcing it through the smoke and fire. Around him, the sky was littered with the remnants of aircraft, spiraling metal, and drifting parachutes. The German fighter remained relentless, circling, stalking him, waiting for a mistake. For a moment, Johnson's mind froze. The plane beneath him might not hold together. Every second could be the last. He tried to remember training, the countless hours in the air, the drills. But everything was chaos. Explosions flashed nearby, shaking the aircraft. Smoke stung his eyes. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He forced himself to focus. One control movement at a time. One breath at a time. He guided the damaged Thunderbolt through a shallow dive, hoping to regain some control. The German ace mirrored his movements effortlessly, staying perfectly aligned, wings almost touching his own. Johnson's hands were slick with sweat and blood. He gritted his teeth and pulled hard on the stick, forcing the plane into a climb. The Thunderbolt groaned under the strain. Flames licked along the engine cowling. Smoke trailed from the tail. He felt the metal flex and twist beneath him. Through the chaos, he saw the German pilot again. Calm, observing, waiting. Johnson realized something terrifying. This was no ordinary engagement. This was personal. Every maneuver, every escape, every breath was being watched. Every second, a calculation was being made. He forced himself to keep climbing, fighting the plane, fighting the fire, fighting fear itself. He refused to fall. He refused to die here. The air around him was thick with smoke and the smell of burning fuel. The sound of engines, gunfire, and explosions pressed in on him from every direction. He gritted his teeth. One movement at a time. Keep the plane steady. Keep breathing. Keep surviving. For a moment, the two planes flew in a deadly dance through smoke and fire. Each movement mirrored, each maneuver countered. Johnson could see the enemy pilot's eyes, calm, calculating, deadly. The gesture, the slow point downward, was a silent command. "You're finished." Johnson clenched the controls. The P-47 shivered violently, but he refused to surrender. Not yet, not here, not now. The sky had become a battlefield of fire and smoke, metal twisting in ways it should never twist, pilots screaming into radios that no longer carried help. Through sheer will, he forced the plane level, guiding it away from falling debris, from fire, from certain death. He could feel the plane tearing apart beneath him, but he kept it in the air. He had no choice. Survival demanded everything he had left. The German fighter stayed close, relentless. The ace's movements precise, perfect. Johnson's mind raced. One more mistake, one more miscalculation, and it would all be over. He fought against the fear, against the pain, against the damaged aircraft that groaned and shuddered with every movement. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. The smoke, the fire, the screaming sky, the chaos of falling aircraft. All faded to the edges of his vision. All that remained was him, the P-47, and the enemy fighter alongside. And in that frozen moment, Johnson made a decision. He would survive. He had to. The sky was a battlefield of fire, smoke, and shredded metal. Johnson's P-47 shuddered violently as another cannon shell tore through the fuselage. Sparks showered across the cockpit, blinding him for a moment. The engine coughed again, then roared back, but unevenly. The plane was wounded. He was wounded. And the German fighter stayed perfectly aligned, circling like a predator that never blinked. He tried to roll, to dive, to escape, but the controls were sluggish, fighting him every inch. Every movement sent vibrations through his arms. Every breath burned his lungs with smoke and the acrid stench of fuel. His left arm throbbed, his vision blurred from blood and sweat. The aircraft felt like it might tear apart under the strain. Through the haze of destruction, Johnson saw another pilot dive into the chaos, guns blazing wildly. Another American plane, barely steady, spun into view, but was immediately struck by enemy fire. Flames engulfed the fuselage, and the pilot vanished, leaving only smoke and the glint of twisted metal. Johnson swallowed his fear. This was war. This was survival. Every second was a battle between life and death. He forced himself to focus on the P-47. Its engine was sputtering. Its wings had deep holes where shells had ripped through. The tail wobbled with each turn. Every pull on the stick was a battle with the aircraft itself. Yet, he had to keep it in the air. He had to survive. He had no choice. The German ace stayed close, pressing, waiting. Johnson could see the pilot's calm face through the canopy. There was no malice, no hatred, just precision, skill, and determination. Johnson realized he was no longer fighting just for survival. He was fighting against a force that was almost machine-like in its execution. Every maneuver, every twist, every pull was countered. The German knew exactly what he was doing before he did it. Johnson gritted his teeth and forced the plane into a sharp climb, pulling against the trembling stick. The Thunderbolt groaned under the pressure, metal creaking and straining. Flames licked the engine cowling, and smoke poured from the wing roots. He forced himself to ignore the pain, to ignore the fear. The enemy pilot mirrored his climb, staying perfectly behind him. Another burst of cannon fire shredded the right wing. Pieces of metal tore away, tumbling through the sky. The Thunderbolt lurched violently, spinning slightly, but Johnson managed to regain control. He forced his breathing to steady, counting each second, each heartbeat. 1, 2, 3. Keep moving. Keep alive. He could see the German ace preparing for another attack. The pilot lined up his guns, firing bursts that shredded the air around Johnson. Sparks flew across the fuselage. The canopy rattled under the impact of near misses. Johnson's right hand shook as he gripped the stick. The plane was damaged beyond reason. Yet somehow he kept it flying. Somehow it stayed in the air. A sudden dive. Johnson pushed the throttle forward, forcing the Thunderbolt down. The wind roared past him. The earth rushed up. The German followed without hesitation, close enough that Johnson could feel the heat of his engines through the air. Another burst of fire. Metal screamed. Johnson's plane shuddered violently. A warning light flashed red. He forced himself to ignore it. Control what you can, survive what you must. Below him, the ground moved rapidly, fields and forests blurring in a swirl of green and brown. The sky was filled with smoke and the wreckage of planes. Parachutes dotted the horizon. Explosions ripped through the formation, trailing fire and smoke behind them. Johnson felt the weight of the battle pressing down on him, thick, suffocating, relentless. He dove again, pulling the plane into a desperate turn. Flames streaked along the engine cowling. The fuselage groaned, yet the P-47 responded just enough. He could feel the aircraft flexing under the strain, metal bending, wings trembling. But it held. Just enough. Barely enough. The German pilot didn't give him a break. Another attack came, precise and brutal. Johnson ducked the worst of it, feeling bullets tear through the air around him. Pieces of his wing broke off, flapping in the wind. Smoke filled the cockpit, and Johnson's vision was half blocked by black soot and blood. Pain shot through his shoulder with every movement. Every second was agony, but he refused to let go. Then, in a sudden moment, the German pulled away slightly, not retreating, not careless, just observing. Johnson realized he had a chance. He pushed the Thunderbolt hard, forcing it into a steep climb despite the trembling wings. The aircraft groaned under the effort. The engine sputtered, smoke trailing behind. But it rose. Slowly, painfully, he gained a few precious feet of altitude. Through the swirling smoke, Johnson could see the German pilot adjusting, preparing for another run. He knew the ace was calculating, waiting for one small mistake. One moment of weakness. One flicker of hesitation. 1 second of distraction. That would be the end. Johnson forced himself to focus entirely on the plane. Breathing, hands, eyes, muscles, mind, all working as one. The smoke stung his eyes. Blood blurred his vision. Pain shot through his arm. The engine groaned, the fuselage shuddered, but he refused to look down at the enemy. He refused to panic. He refused to die here. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time felt fractured, a blur of fire, smoke, twisted metal, and screaming wind. He forced a shallow dive, gaining speed, feeling the wings strain under the pressure. The German ace mirrored every movement, but Johnson was ready. He could not outgun him, could not outmaneuver him completely, but he could survive. He had to. Through sheer will, through determination, through refusing to let death claim him, Johnson guided the P-47. The plane was shredded, smoking, battered beyond reason, but still flying, still alive. And in that moment, Johnson realized something. This battle wasn't about victory or glory. It was about survival. It was about refusing to surrender to impossible odds. Every second in the air, every maneuver, every heartbeat was a fight against death itself, and he was still in control. Above the shattered fields of northern France, Johnson's P-47, damaged and smoking, still flew. The German ace continued to shadow him, relentless, precise. But Johnson had survived. He had kept the plane in the air. Against every probability, against every expectation, he was still alive. And this was only the beginning. The sky had become a canvas of chaos. Smoke, fire, and falling wreckage filled every direction. Johnson's P-47 groaned with every movement, metal twisting under the strain. His cockpit was a mess of shattered glass, smoke, and blood. His left arm throbbed with pain. His shoulder burned, his vision blurred, but he refused to give in. One thought repeated in his mind: survive. The German fighter stayed close, relentless, circling him, waiting for the slightest mistake. Johnson knew any error could mean instant death. He forced the Thunderbolt into a shallow dive to gain speed, but the damaged wings shuddered violently, threatening to tear apart. Smoke poured from the engine, mixing with the smell of burning metal and oil, stinging his eyes, filling his lungs. Every second in the air felt like a lifetime. Johnson's hands were steady now, though blood slicked them. Every muscle in his body screamed. Every nerve was on fire. But he focused. He could not lose control. Not here. Not now. The plane was barely responding, but he coaxed it through turns, pulls, and dives, using every bit of skill he had learned over countless missions. Then, it happened. A burst of cannon fire tore through the fuselage, this time hitting near the tail. The P-47 shuddered violently, and Johnson realized the stabilizer was damaged. The plane wobbled uncontrollably, and for a moment, he felt it. A pure, terrifying fear. The aircraft could break apart at any second. But Johnson didn't panic. He adjusted the throttle, twisted the stick, and forced the plane into a controlled spin. He used the dive to gain speed, letting gravity pull the plane forward while he fought to regain control. The air ripped past him, the clouds streaked by, and the German fighter mirrored him, staying perfectly aligned. Through the haze of smoke and adrenaline, Johnson caught a glimpse of the ground rushing toward him. Forests, fields, rivers, all blurred into streaks of green and brown. He realized he was dangerously low, too low for comfort. Every second he spent battling the controls was a gamble with death. The German ace dove in for another attack, wings aligned, guns blazing. Johnson twisted the stick violently, avoiding the worst of the fire, but the impact shook the plane like a giant hand had struck it. Sparks flew across the fuselage. Another burst tore through the wing. The P-47's engine coughed and roared unevenly, flames flickering along the cowling. The aircraft was literally falling apart, but somehow it stayed in the air. Johnson's mind raced. He had to survive. He couldn't outgun the German in this condition. He couldn't outrun him, but he could outthink him. He began to weave, using the damaged wings to his advantage, forcing the German into maneuvers that risked overextending. Each turn was calculated, each pull measured. One miscalculation, and it would all be over. Another burst of cannon fire struck near the cockpit. Johnson felt the impact reverberate through his chest. The seat harness dug into him, restricting his movements, but he forced himself to focus. Eyes on the instruments, hands on the stick, mind calculating. The plane shuddered violently, metal groaning, yet he forced it to climb. Smoke poured from the engine, but the P-47 obeyed. Barely. Suddenly, the German pilot broke formation, pulling up aggressively. Johnson realized he had a chance. He pushed the Thunderbolt into a steep climb, using every ounce of remaining engine power. The plane shuddered violently, wings trembling. Flames licked the cowling. Smoke poured from the tail. Every second felt like it could be the last. But he climbed, slowly, painfully. The German followed, but he was forced to adjust, giving Johnson a slight advantage. Johnson forced a shallow dive, regaining speed, and executed a series of desperate maneuvers. Barrel rolls, tight turns, and abrupt climbs, each one pushing the damaged plane beyond its limits. The German mirrored him perfectly, but Johnson's determination was unbreakable. He knew he couldn't win in a traditional fight. He had to survive, and survival meant using the plane's limits against the enemy's expectations. Through the smoke and chaos, Johnson spotted another plane falling in flames nearby. A pilot ejected, parachute deploying, drifting away from the inferno. Johnson's heart pounded as he realized how close death was, how fragile life could be in the sky. One mistake, one mechanical failure, and it would be him next. Another attack from the German ace. This time, Johnson was ready. He twisted the stick, forced the Thunderbolt into a near-impossible roll, and used the dive to gain speed. The German followed, but the P-47 held together. Smoke poured from the engine, flames flickered along the fuselage, metal groaned, yet it remained airborne. Johnson forced himself to breathe, to focus, to survive. The sky around him was a storm of fire, smoke, and twisted metal. Every second was agony. Every movement required every ounce of strength he could summon. And yet, against impossible odds, he kept flying. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The German ace continued to press, but Johnson began to see a slight opening. Using the damaged P-47's momentum, he forced a tight turn, dodging cannon fire and gaining a few feet of altitude. The German had to adjust, breaking the rhythm that had made him lethal. For the first time, Johnson felt a glimmer of hope. The P-47 shuddered under the strain, flames licking the nose, smoke pouring from the tail. Johnson's hands were raw, his arms shaking, his vision blurred, but he had survived another wave. He had kept the plane airborne. Against every probability, against every expectation, he was still alive. And in that instant, he realized something crucial. Survival wasn't about defeating the enemy. It wasn't about victory. It wasn't even about skill alone. It was about willpower, determination, refusing to surrender, refusing to die, refusing to let the sky claim him. Johnson leveled the Thunderbolt as best he could. The German ace circled, waiting, but Johnson had gained precious seconds. Seconds he would need for the final push toward safety. He forced the damaged plane forward, eyes scanning the horizon for the nearest Allied base, for any sign of hope. The battle had reached a turning point. Johnson was still in the air, still alive. The German ace was still deadly, but the P-47, though battered and smoking, was still flying. Against impossible odds, Johnson had survived wave after wave of destruction, and now the final struggle was beginning. The fight to land, to survive, to tell the story of what no one else could believe. The ground was coming up fast. Forests, fields, rivers, all blurred into a chaotic streak of green and brown as Johnson fought to keep the P-47 steady. Every vibration, every shudder of the damaged aircraft reminded him of how close he was to death. Metal groaned beneath him. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared, flames licking the cowling. Smoke poured from the tail like a black ribbon of warning. The German ace still shadowed him, relentless, circling, eyes unblinking. Johnson's hands were raw, slick with blood, shaking from pain, adrenaline, and exhaustion. His left arm throbbed with every movement. Every second he held on to the controls felt like a lifetime. Every second he faltered could be the last. He pushed the P-47 into a steep dive, forcing speed. The wings trembled violently, but the aircraft held. The air screamed past him, the wind tearing at the fuselage. The German ace followed, keeping the pressure relentless. Tracer fire lit the sky again, but Johnson twisted the stick, banked sharply, and barely avoided another deadly burst. And then suddenly, the German broke off. Not retreating, just assessing. Johnson had gained a fraction of breathing room. His heart hammered in his chest. He knew he wasn't out of danger, but this small gap gave him a chance. A chance to survive. A chance to land. He scanned the horizon. Allied territory lay ahead, just over the forest line. The nearest airfield was miles away, and the P-47's controls were failing with each second. The rudder barely responded. The flaps were useless. One wrong move could tear the plane apart in midair. Every moment was a test of skill, courage, and sheer will. Johnson forced himself to focus. He adjusted the throttle, twisted the stick, corrected for the failing rudder, and coaxed the P-47 into the flattest glide he could manage. The plane shuddered, but it obeyed, and inch by inch, he gained ground. Smoke streamed behind him. Flames flickered along the engine, licking the wing roots. The canopy glass was spider-webbed with cracks, blurring the sky. But the plane was still flying. Seconds stretched like hours. Johnson's mind was hyper-focused. He could feel every vibration, every heartbeat, every shudder of the aircraft. The German fighter had pulled away, circling above, watching, calculating, but not firing. Johnson realized that he had survived the impossible, survived against a skillful, ruthless enemy, and now it was a battle with the aircraft itself. He lined up the P-47 with the airstrip, sweat pouring into his eyes, hands raw, muscles screaming from strain. The plane trembled violently as he descended. He fought the stick, nudged the throttle, adjusted the rudder, and carefully guided the Thunderbolt closer to the runway. The flaps barely responded, but he forced them down. The wheels scraped against the ground, the tires skimming the surface before the plane finally settled, bouncing violently, wings quivering, smoke trailing behind. Silence fell. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Johnson exhaled shakily, his body trembling from exhaustion and relief. The P-47, battered, shredded, bleeding metal and fire, had landed. Somehow, against every probability, against impossible odds, he had survived. Mechanics rushed forward, their faces a mix of shock and awe. Johnson climbed out of the cockpit, legs shaking, blood dripping from his shoulder and forehead. He looked at the plane, the fuselage twisted, wings scarred with holes, engine cowling blackened and smoking, and realized he had flown it through 32 hits. 32 rounds had torn through his aircraft. And yet, he had survived. He had conquered chaos itself. Word of his return spread quickly. Pilots, ground crew, and commanders alike could barely believe what they saw. The P-47 looked like it had survived a storm of metal and fire that should have destroyed it completely. Johnson's story became immediate legend. The young pilot who had fought through impossible odds, dodged death dozens of times, and landed a plane that should have been shredded to pieces was now a symbol of courage, skill, and determination. But the story didn't end with the landing. Johnson's survival had an impact far beyond the airfield. His experience became a case study in resilience, in understanding aircraft limits, in the sheer power of focus and will under extreme pressure. Pilots who heard the story studied it, learning the importance of remaining calm under fire, of controlling fear, and of never giving up, no matter the odds. In the wider war, it was a reminder that courage and determination could turn the tide, even in moments when victory seemed impossible. The German ace, the relentless enemy, the flak, the smoke, the shattered metal, none of it mattered in the end. Johnson's will to survive and his skill as a pilot had carried him through the inferno. He had faced death, stared it in the eye, and refused to surrender. Years later, the story of the P-47 and its pilot would be told over and over. Historians, writers, and storytellers recounted the mission, the chaos in the sky, the enemy ace circling relentlessly, and the miraculous survival. The aircraft itself became a symbol, preserved and studied for decades, a testament to what could be achieved with courage, skill, and determination. Johnson never forgot that day. The smoke, the fire, the cacophony of exploding aircraft, the weight of the enemy on his tail, they haunted him, yes, but they also defined him. He had survived what almost no one else could. He had faced chaos, destruction, and death, and he had lived to tell the tale. And in the end, the lesson remained clear. Courage, skill, and the refusal to surrender, even when the odds are impossibly against you, can turn the tide of survival. The P-47, battered and scarred, became a legend. Robert Johnson became a symbol, and the story of the pilot who survived 32 hits and still landed his plane would echo through history, inspiring generations to face the impossible with determination, precision, and unbreakable will. The sky was quiet now. Smoke lingered on the horizon. The wreckage of planes, the echoes of cannon fire, the ghosts of those who had fallen, they were all part of the story. But one thing remained unmistakable. One young pilot had faced the impossible and survived. And that moment changed everything, for him, for those who flew after him, and for the legacy of courage in the skies.